Hi everybody, Jane here, and we're going to talk about first-person point of view. So first-person point of view appears pretty regularly in cozy mysteries, it appears pretty regularly in chick lit, and also I see it a lot in young adult and fantasy. It does appear other places too, but those are ones that a lot of the books, probably the majority of the books, are in first person. So what is first person? First person is a story that is told by a character. It can be through letters, it can be through journal entries, it can be conversationally, like I'm a character and I'm telling you what's happening. It can also be told in the present or in the past. I can be a character who's, 50 years old looking at something that happened when they were 20. Or I can have you come through the adventure with me as I tell you. This is a really good point of view and one that is used frequently, especially if you have an audience that you really want to connect with the narrator. It is a great one and very commonly used, but it also has some problems along with it, like all points of view do. So what are some of the great things about first person point of view? Well, the best one is that the reader really connects with the narrator if you've done your job. So the characters, I think, in first person are a lot more memorable. One of my favorite series told in first person is The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. And I think those characters were so memorable because they're taking us on their story. They're telling us how they feel. It's very intimate. It's not, and this is how he felt. It's, this is what I experienced. And I think it's a lot more heart-wrenching to hear basically like somebody say, this is what happened to me. It's also more naturally like how we would tell a story to a friend. So it's very intimate, it's very deep, and I love first person for that reason. I think it does a good job with really bringing us into that and just showing us how a character sees themselves. One of my favorite characters that's written in first person is Janie Austen from the Janie Austen mystery series. And she's hilarious. She's got this funny character voice, and you really couldn't bring that out in third person because so much of it is her perspective on the world. She thinks she's a fat girl. I'm on the debate that she's not, but let's say that she's a fat girl or she thinks she is. And she'll be like, yeah, I was heading over to McDonald's, gonna get me a salad, left with the Big Mac. She doesn't quite use the actual McDonald's place names, I think, for, legality reasons, but that's what she's talking about. And I love that about her. I love her voice, and character voice is amazing. And it done well, it can really connect a reader to the character. Another thing that first person does well is relaying information in character voice. Sometimes as a writer, it's really hard to relay information you think that the reader needs, but if you can do it in character voice, it doesn't feel like an info dump, whereas sometimes if you're doing it in third person, it does. It feels like, oh my gosh, you're just paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph of this information. Whereas a first person narrator can kind of turn it into a funny story, can make it into a joke, can reveal it in a way that is conversational and the reader doesn't realize that they're getting this vital information. So again, when it's done well, it can be done really well. Another thing that is both kind of a disadvantage and advantage, I think it depends, of first person, is the unreliable narrator. You can tell a character's story and have there be confusion about whether what they're saying is true or not. A really good example of this is, let me see if I can figure out how to pronounce his name, Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. So I read this in high school, and our teacher told us that there was a lot of information in the book to hint that it was an unreliable narrator. So basically, the Metamorphosis is a story about this guy named Gregory who wakes up and realizes he is a giant bug. And everybody in his family kind of freaks out, and he just goes and lives in the dining room as a giant bug until he dies. And it's a really interesting thing because I was taught, the indications from the people around Gregory say that he's not a bug, he's just somebody who lost his mind and is, having a mental health breakdown. But I've heard other people who were taught in school that no, this person actually turned into a bug, and they didn't have that unreliable narrator. discussion. Unreliable narrators happen in movies and TV and video games as well. And when done, it can be really cool to be like, oh my gosh, that's crazy that was what they thought. One of my favorite examples of this in a TV, which again, TV is a little bit different than a book because you're not having that first person narration, but you kind of are following a character, is in Buffy. There's an episode in Buffy where, I believe it's the 5th season, where she's in an insane asylum, and she basically, everything that's happened, to her up to this point, it has basically been her mental instability. She's just a girl, and she has to choose to go back to the Buffy world. But I really like that episode, and there was kind of a debate: is this real, or is it like some kind of magic to screw with the Slayer's head? But it makes a lot of sense when you look at the whole series, because crazy stuff happens in that series, and it makes more sense for that series to be the delusions of some girl who's mentally, not in a good place, than it does for the series to be, this girl who gets superpowers, and suddenly season 5, a sister comes in who's a key and nobody remembers her, and, just the crazy stuff that happens. So I will say that with first person, back to the first person in books, an unreliable narrator can be a really cool thing if you want to tell a story that is, you want people to kind of believe it, but you want there to be some doubt. And I think that's one of the best ways that you can be, not clear and still have a good story. If you're right, or if your character doesn't really know or thinks reality is one way, but if you leave some hints that reality is another way, it can make for a really good story. So what are the downsides of first person? Well, number one, you have to reveal anything that the character that is narrating knows, and you can't reveal anything they don't know, which in both ways is kind of limiting. So if I am the narrator and I'm solving a mystery, you have to realize at the time that I realize who the killer is, I have to tell you. Otherwise, it's not fair. On the other hand, I can't witness anything that, as a reader, that the character didn't witness or hear about or isn't aware of. So it's very hard to relay information that the narrator doesn't know unless you can make it kind of dense or make it, real subtle. It's very hard. Another thing is that, again, if I know something as a narrator and I don't reveal it like the whole time, it feels like cheating when I do reveal it, which I think is one reason that the Sherlock Holmes books are told from Watson's perspective, because, Sherlock knows stuff ahead of time, and he's also not a very fun person. Like, he's got problems, so it wouldn't be very fun to follow him, but we follow Watson. And that is another issue. If you have a narrator who's not very likable, it can cause a lot of problems with readers. For me, this was one of the challenges I had with reading the Twilight series. I did not like Bella. And I liked the books, I liked the world, but I really hated her as a narrator. And I just did not connect with her at all. And I was in my 20s when I read it, which was probably part of it, because she very much was a whiny teenage girl, and I just didn't like that. So that's another challenge. If your narrator is somebody who's unlikable, it can be really hard for a reader to connect with them. Another issue is that your narrator is probably not going to die. So I think your readers get a sense that everything is going to turn out okay. Now, that's not always the case, and as a matter of fact, in my first book, Singing the Last Song, I did first-person perspective, and my character, at the end, does die. And I've mentioned that before, so that's not a big spoiler. But everybody in the book pretty much dies. But it's like, she doesn't die before the story's over, but she's like in a situation where she's going to die. So you can kind of counteract that, but a lot of times as a reader, it's like, oh, okay, well, obviously this person is going to get out of it alive. So when we're in the really tight situations, it's like, well, how are we going to solve this? Not, oh my gosh, are they going to be okay? Another challenge. It's harder for a reader to know the first person characters point of view's name. That's not always true, but it is frequently. Like, because they're always saying I, and unless you have their name frequently in conversation, you tend to forget what their name is. I read a lot of the Sophie Kinsella books, and I never can remember anybody's name or the narrator's names because they're mostly in first person. And while that's a lot of fun, then people will say their name, and I'll be like, wait, who's that? It's the person telling the story. Another problem with the first person point of view is that usually it's hard to have more than one narrator in a book. It can be done, but it's a challenge. It's hard to keep straight who people are, and as a writer, it can be hard to write in multiple voices that don't sound all the same. That's one of the biggest criticisms I hear about books that are written in first person point of view is, well, everybody sounds the same. And so it kind of pulls you out because they do sound so different. I had this problem in my book, Singing the Last Song. I wrote two point of view characters, and I did try to differentiate the voices, like Birdie swears, Sharon doesn't. But I know that was one of the complaints about the book, was that it was too hard to have two, and even like I labeled each section, this is Birdie, this is Sharon, and it just was confusing. And I've heard from readers that generally they don't like that. So just be aware of that when you decide to do multiple perspectives in a first person point of view story. Another challenge I've had in writing first person. My book, The Alpha's Daughter, this one here, I'd originally written it in first person, and then I changed it to third person. And the reason I started out in first person is because it was it was a spin-off to The Wolf's Pregnant Bride. Pull that one up too. It was a spin-off to this one. So you have The Wolf's Pregnant Bride, and there is a diary that is found that reveals a secret, and it is the diary of my main character in this one, which is Tamsin. So I thought, oh, well, I have her diary here, I should write in first person point of view. Well, that ended up not working for a lot of reasons. One, because I would have had to do the alternating back and forth with the first person point of view between her and Walter, who's the love interest in the story. And that just wasn't working out. It was very hard voice-wise to do. And secondly, and I think this is really true when you're writing historical, but it can be true in other genres too. If you don't know what your character would say, it's hard to describe something accurately. Here's my example, or if it would be confusing. So, The Alpha's Daughter is a romance. And I really realized I was in trouble when I got to the intimate scene because, and I think this is a huge problem in first person in general, because what we would call stuff is a lot harder. Like, you're probably not going to say anything really vulgar in your head when describing your experience. I know if I'm telling my best friend what happened, I'm not going to be real, like, graphic. And in this story, I have the additional problem of I have Tamsin, who is a fairly innocent girl. It's her first time when she is with Walter, but also she's living during the time of Henry VIII. So a lot of the slang that we have now is either different or is not stuff that I feel comfortable using. So I knew for a fact that the C word was around at that time, but I hate that word. I almost never use it because I find it offensive. Like, I just don't like that word. And some other words that obviously were less offensive, there was one that was a coney, which is like a kind of bunny, and a cunny, again, the bunny type thing. I'm not really sure. I was doing research and these were like slang words for girl parts. But I thought if I start saying, he touched her coney, he touched my coney, nobody's going to know what that means. I mean, they can probably extrapolate it, but it's just going to be so disturbing and disruptive. I tried and I just couldn't do it. So I ended up, and I think, again, because I'm not from that era in time, there was a lot of things that I probably could get more leeway with because I wasn't in first person. Because if I, describe something or call it something slightly wrong, I am the narrator. or the narrator's the narrator in the book. Whereas if Tamsin is narrating, she has to know what everything's called. She's living in this world. She has to use words that are appropriate to the world. Where I think when you've got a third person narrator, you can get a little bit more slack. Maybe not in the dialogue, but definitely in the story itself. So that's something to consider with first person as well. How well do you know the world if it is a real place and if it is a real time? Like, I wouldn't use it a lot of times in historical unless you are really, really good at knowing what words they used, what what their thought processes would have been, and not especially people in history didn't always think about things or feel about things the way we do now. And to portray a character accurately is important in that time period. And I think that is easier to do in third person than it is in first person. So those are kind of my thoughts on first person. I do love first person. I don't write in it a lot, but when I do write in it, I enjoy it. So tell me what you think. What is your favorite book written in first person? What do you love about first person? What do you hate about first person? Have you written first person? Leave a comment about it below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit like. And if you want more content, please hit subscribe. Thanks. Bye.